So you might be wondering, is running Claude Code on my personal computer a good idea? You might be signed into all sorts of command line tools that give Claude Code access to a whole bunch of potentially sensitive information and systems. And if you're thinking this, you're not alone. A lot of folks in enterprise scenarios are thinking this, and it's been a big blocker for those folks to actually scale out Claude Code across their enterprise. So I'm just going to show you a really quick way where you can run Claude Code in a containerized environment that's completely independent from your personal computer, where you can be really crisp on exactly what Claude Code actually has access to, just to make sure that it doesn't do anything disastrous. So to do this, we're going to use a dev container that is actually shipped by Anthropic, and we're going to deploy that onto Railway. And finally, we'll use SSH to connect to that container where we can interact with Claude Code in a sandbox-like environment. So as you can see, I'll just go over the Railway setup really quickly here. It's real basic. We essentially have that Docker container, and we've got a volume, which we've just mounted to the root directory of the container so that we can maintain Claude Code state across restarts of the container, as well as any project specifics that Claude might be working on. So in this specific example, Claude has access to Git. So maybe Claude has synced a couple of repositories and is working on those. We don't want to lose that context due to a container restart. So in terms of the actual container, as I mentioned, this is shipped by Anthropic in their Claude Code repository. So if you navigate there, you can see there's this dev container folder. There's a Docker file in here, as well as some various configuration options and scripts. We click in. It's a pretty basic setup. It's installing some developer tools. You can see Git there. It does a little bit of firewall setup with that shell script, and finally installs the node as well as Claude Code through node. So I've gone ahead and forked this. This is kind of essential just to be able to deploy it in Railway. I've also made a few small modifications to that Docker file. So I've gone ahead and opened a pull request from my fork, and we can see I've just made some changes to the directories that we're actually initializing. I want this to run in root, which is where all of the Claude settings and things are being stored. And this is also, you can think of this as like the user directory. And this is where we mount that volume to in Railway so that we can preserve that across restarts. And then finally, I just make sure that this container sleeps infinitely when we actually start it up in Railway, and that means we can just SSH over to it as we need. So if we pop over to Railway here, I'll just walk through the configuration settings. So if we go over to settings, you can see I am pointing at that Claude Code fork in my own GitHub account. I set the root directory to that dev container directory. This is essential just because of some path references within the Docker file for copying that firewall script. If we don't set the root directory or working directory to this dev container folder, it's not going to work. And I've also configured some variables here. Most importantly is this Railway Docker file path. So that's just pointing to that Docker file. By default, Railway is going to look in the repository root for that Docker file. So we just go ahead and configure that manually here. Optionally, you can set an OAuth token here as well. However, because we've got this volume mounted to the container, it's going to store any credentials so you can log in with your subscription interactively, and that will just be stored in this volume. So we actually click the volume here. You can see I've basically just mounted this root path, and that's where all the Claude Code settings are, like I mentioned, as well as just where we'll be pulling any GitHub repositories or storing any artifacts as Claude Code works. And so once that's all set up, it should just deploy. It's really straightforward. And now I'm going to pop over to my command line. So I'll be using the Railway CLI. I've already logged in and everything here connected to this project, but you can see there's this SSH command. Now this just provides us, I don't think this is true SSH, but it effectively is SSH. This allows us to connect to that container over the internet and basically interact with it through the command line. So if we run railway SSH, like I said, I've already connected to this project in the background using this link command, but you'll have to do that on your first setup. And now you can see we're just in the container. So if I run ls a, we can see we've already got some of the Claude Code stuff initialized. I can go ahead and run Claude, and now we're just in Claude here. So I can ask any ordinary questions. I don't know, can you tell me about projects we are working on in this directory? And it's going to be the same experience as if you were running locally, except in this case, it is in a completely isolated environment. We can install tools as we need. Just make sure you're updating that Docker file script rather than doing it directly, so that all survives the container restart. But yeah, it's a relatively straightforward process here. So kind of the natural extension of this is, this works really well for individuals or very small organizations where they can just stand containers up and instruct their employees to go and use those containers for Claude Code. But it gets a little bit messier with Claude in a large enterprise. What happens if we're deploying this through Azure or Google Cloud? And that's where our enterprise lives. And maybe we want to be very crisp on the RBAC roles that are permitted, or we want to make sure that users aren't actually able to sign into any AAD applications when they connect to this container, and that maybe it comes pre-installed with a managed identity that has very specific RBAC roles. We're going to get into that in a future video. This is really just the tip of the iceberg. So if you'd like to see more on that, let me know. Otherwise, just keep an eye out for future videos. Thanks for watching.